Hi everyone, as promised, I'm going to be reading this to you. This is chapter 2, and I'm just rereading what you have hopefully already read. But I thought I'd read it to you so that you felt happy that you understood what happened in this chapter. That evening, Mr. Utterson came home to his bachelor house in sombre spirits and sat down to dinner without relish. It was his custom of a Sunday, when this meal was over, to sit close by the fire, a volume of some dry divinity on his reading desk, until the clock of the neighbouring church rang out the hour of 12, when he would go soberly and gratefully to bed. On this night, however, as soon as the cloth was taken away, he took up a candle and went to his business room. There he opened his safe, took from the most private part of it a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will, and sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. The will was holograph, for Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now that it was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. It provided not only that in the case of the decease of Henry Jekyll, M.D., D.Sc.L., LL.D., F.R.S., etc., all his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde, but that in the case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, the said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay, and free from any burden or obligation beyond the payment of a few small sums to the members of the doctor's household. This document had long been the lawyer's eyesore. It offended him, both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life, to whom the fanciful was the immodest. And hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation. Now, by a sudden turn, it was his knowledge. It was already bad enough when the name was but a name of which he could learn no more. It was worse when it began to be clothed upon with detestable attributes, and out of the shifting, insubstantial mist that had so long baffled his eye, there leapt up the sudden, definite presentment of a fiend. So I'm just going to pause there. If you remember, this is the opening to this chapter where Utterson is inspecting the will that has been made by Dr. Jekyll. Now, the interesting part here is, for a start, we get a little insight into Utterson's usual life. He comes in sombre spirits today, so he's not in a very good mood, and he sits down and doesn't really enjoy his dinner. And normally, when the dinner's over, he would then go and read, and then at about 12 o'clock he would go to bed. But today, instead of doing that, as soon as dinner is over, he takes his candle and goes to his business room, his study, and opens his safe. And from the most private part of it, so in other words, he keeps it really safe and hidden, is the document with Dr. Jekyll's will written on the front. He sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents, suggests that he is not happy about what he's reading. The fact that the will was holograph is significant because Utterson didn't write the will for Dr. Jekyll. Normally, the lawyer would be the one to write out the will, and in this case, because Mr. Utterson didn't agree with the terms and thought it was so strange, he actually refused to take any part in writing the will. So Dr. Jekyll was the one that actually had to write it with his own hand. And in this particular will, it's unusual because the possessions of Dr. Jekyll are passed to Mr. Hyde not only on the case of Dr. Jekyll's death, which would be the case with the normal will, but also if he were to disappear or have an unexplained absence for more than 3 months. So this document has played on Utterson's mind for a while, but he hadn't really put a name, he hadn't really known who Mr. Hyde was. So it says here that it offended him both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life. So he liked to do things the right way, the normal way, the way that makes sense, the rational and logical way. And this seems fanciful and therefore somehow ungentlemanly and wrong. And now it was before his ignorance of Mr. Hyde, the fact that he didn't know him made him feel indignant and annoyed, but now the fact that he knows him and knows bad things about him makes him even more concerned. He goes on to say, "I thought it was madness," he said, as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe, "and now I begin to fear it is disgrace." So it is this idea that actually there is something going on where Dr. Jekyll has done something wrong, and that is why he's being forced by blackmail to write his will to Mr. Hyde. And he fears that Jekyll is actually in disgrace, the sort of greatest fear of a Victorian gentleman. And that's how it links to the idea of a Victorian gentleman, which is one of the tasks that I asked you to think about. With that, he blew out his candle, put on a greatcoat, and set forth in the direction of Cavendish Square, that citadel of medicine where his friend, the great Dr. Lanyon, had his house and received his crowding patients. If anyone knows, it will be Lanyon, he had thought. The solemn butler knew and welcomed him. He was subjected to no stage of delay, but was ushered direct from the door to the dining room, where Dr. Lanyon sat alone over his wine. This was a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman with a shock of hair prematurely white and a boisterous and decided manner. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, he sprang up from his chair and welcomed him with both hands. The geniality, as was the way of the man, was somewhat theatrical to the eye, but it reposed on genuine feeling. For these two were old friends, old mates both at school and college, both thorough respecters of themselves and of each other, and what does not always follow, men who thoroughly enjoyed each other's company. After a little rambling talk, the lawyer led up to the subject, which so disagreeably preoccupied his mind. "I suppose, Lanyon," said he, "you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has." "I wish the friends were younger," chuckled Dr. Lanyon, "but I suppose we are. And what of that? I see little of him now." "Indeed?" said Utterson. "I thought you had a bond of common interest." "We had," was the reply, "but it was more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind, and though, of course, I continue to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, as they say, I see and I have seen devilish little of that man. Such unscientific balderdash," added the doctor, flushing suddenly purple, "would have estranged Damon and Pythias." So I'll just pause there. If you remember from the help that you were given when this was presented to you with your work, this is Lanyon explaining why he's not been particularly close with Jekyll, and it appears that Jekyll, who is a scientist and therefore that was their common interest, has somehow got himself looking at something that Lanyon sees as balderdash, unscientific balderdash, and he's saying this such balderdash would actually make Damon and Pythias become unfriendly or not friends anymore. And these two, as I said, are from Greek mythology, and they are seen to be sort of examples of the perfect friendship. So it's saying even they would be not able to stay friends when faced with this kind of foolish endeavour. This little spirit of temper was somewhat of a relief to Mr. Utterson. They have only differed on some point of science, he thought, and being a man of no scientific passions, except in the matter of conveyancing, he even added, "It is nothing worse than that." He gave his friend a few seconds to recover his composure, then approached the question he had come to put. "Did you ever come across a protégé of his? One Hyde?" he asked. "Hyde?" repeated Lanyon. "No, never heard of him since my time." That was the amount of information that the lawyer carried back with him to the great dark bed on which he tossed to and fro until the small hours of the morning began to grow large. It was a night of little ease to his toiling mind, toiling in mere darkness and besieged by questions. 6 o'clock struck on the bells of the church that was so conveniently near to Mr. Utterson's dwelling, and still he was digging at the problem. Hitherto it had touched him in the intellectual side alone, but now his imagination also was engaged, or rather enslaved. And as he lay and tossed in the gross darkness of the night in the curtained room, Mr. Enfield's tale went by before his mind in a scroll of lighted pictures. He would be aware of the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city, then of the figure of a man walking swiftly, then of a child running from the doctors. Then these met, and that human juggernaut trod the child down and passed on regardless of her screams. Or else he would see a room in a rich house where his friend lay asleep, dreaming and smiling at his dreams. And then the door of the room would be opened, the curtains of the bed plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would stand by his side a figure to whom power was given, and even at that dead hour he must rise and do its bidding. So this, I'm just pausing here, this is a really long paragraph. I just wanted to explain here that this is where he's talking about his nightmares and kind of thinking about, he's going through all of the events that he's been described with Mr. Hyde. And this idea of how the fact that this person is making him, he must rise and do its bidding, is this idea of somebody forcing Jekyll to do something. The figure in these two phases haunted the lawyer all night, and if at any time he dozed over, it was to see it glide more stealthily through sleeping houses, or move the more swiftly, and still the more swiftly, even to dizziness, through wider labyrinths of lamplighted city, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. And still the figure had no face by which he might know it. Even in his dreams it had no face, or one that baffled him and melted before his eyes, and thus it was there sprang up and grew apace in the lawyer's mind a singularly strong, almost an inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde. If he could but once set eyes on him, he thought, the mystery would lighten and perhaps roll away altogether away, as was the habit of mysterious things when well examined. He might see a reason for his friend's strange preference, or bondage, call it which you please, and even for the startling clause of the will. At least it would be a face worth seeing, the face of a man who was without the bowels of mercy, a face which had but to show itself to rise up in the mind of the unimpressionable Enfield a spirit of enduring hatred. Okay, I'm a bit out of breath after reading all that, so sorry about that. But you can see here that the idea that he's really worrying about who this guy is, who Mr. Hyde is, and why he could possibly have such a hold over Jekyll. And he's decided that in order to sort of try and get it out of his mind and stop worrying about it, he needs to go and find Mr. Hyde and see his face for himself. And so that he's not kind of just imagining this person, this faceless person. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street of shops. In the morning before office hours, at noon when business was plenty and time scarce, at night under the face of the fogged city moon, by all lights and at all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was found to be on his chosen posts. So this is the bit that we were talking about today, how he actually goes and kind of stalks Mr. Hyde and decides to that he wants to find him and talk to him so that he can learn a bit more about him. If he be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek, making a little joke there. And at last his patience was rewarded. It was a fine dry night, frost in the air, the streets as clean as a ballroom floor, the lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed and the by-street was very solitary, and in spite of the low growl of London from all around, very silent. Small sounds carried far. Domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumour of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he was aware of the odd light footstep drawing near. In the course of his nightly patrols, he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person, while he was still a great way off, suddenly spring out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. Yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested, and it was with a strong superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. The steps drew swiftly nearer and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned on the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forth from the entry, could soon see what manner of man he had to deal with. He was small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. But he made straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time, and as he came he drew a key from his pocket, like one approaching home. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. "Mr. Hyde, I think." Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of breath. But his fear was only momentary, and though he did not look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough. "That is my name. What do you want?" "I see you are going in," returned the lawyer. "I am an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. You must have heard of my name, and meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might admit me." "You will not find Dr. Jekyll. He is from home," replied Mr. Hyde, blowing in the key. And then suddenly, but still without looking up, "How did you know me?" he asked. "On your side," said Mr. Utterson. "Will you do me a favour?" "With pleasure," replied the other. "What shall it be?" "Will you let me see your face?" asked the lawyer. Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon some sudden reflection, fronted about with an air of defiance, and the pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds. "Now I shall know you again," said Mr. Utterson. "It may be useful." "Yes," returned Mr. Hyde. "It is as well we have met, and apropos, you should have my address." And he gave the number of a street in Soho. Good God, thought Mr. Utterson, can he too have been thinking of the will? But he kept his feelings to himself and only grunted in acknowledgment of the address. "And now," said the other, "how did you know me?" "By description," was the reply. "Whose description?" "We have common friends," said Mr. Utterson. "Common friends?" echoed Mr. Hyde a little hoarsely. "Who are they?" "Jekyll, for instance," said the lawyer. "He never told you," cried Mr. Hyde with a flush of anger. "I don't think he would have lied." "Come," said Mr. Utterson, "that is not fitting language." The other snarled aloud into a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he had locked the door and disappeared into the house. Okay, so again, this is a funny interaction that we have here, a strange interaction with Mr. Hyde, and he appears to be very annoyed at the idea that Utterson knows who he is. Now, of course, it is Enfield who has told the story, and Utterson hasn't spoken to Jekyll about Mr. Hyde at all, but it is Jekyll is the name that he uses, and he doesn't mention Enfield. And Mr. Hyde is furious when he thinks that Jekyll may have talked about him or described him, and in fact, therefore, implies that Mr. Utterson is lying. Now, Utterson isn't necessarily lying here, but he certainly doesn't say the whole truth. And now we have seen this side of Mr. Hyde is quite a volatile character, somebody who is likely to erupt and lose their temper quite easily. The lawyer stood a while when Mr. Hyde had left him, the picture of disquietude. Disquietude here just means kind of like not happy, like unsettled, displeased and stressed, I guess. Then he began slowly to mount the street, pausing every step or two and putting his hand to his brow like a man in mental perplexity. The problem he was thus debating as he walked was one of a class that is rarely solved. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and he spoke with a husky, whispering and somewhat broken voice. All these points were against him, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. "There must be something else," said the perplexed gentleman. "There is something more, if I could find a name for it. God bless me, the man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic, shall we say? Or can it be the old story of Dr. Fell? Or is it the mere radiance of a foul soul that thus transpires through and transfigures its clay continent?" "The last, I think, for oh, my poor old Henry Jekyll. If ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend." So in this last section here, we have Utterson almost talking directly to Jekyll, although obviously Jekyll is not there, and saying something quite strong. He's really saying that, that he sees the devil, Satan, on Hyde's face, and really labels him as a devil, as somebody who is evil. So I did say that I'd forgotten the reference to Dr. Fell. Dr. Fell comes from a nursery rhyme, an old nursery rhyme. And it says something like, I do not like thee, Dr. Fell, the reason why I cannot tell. So it's just the same thing. It's like he can't put his finger on why he doesn't like him, but he sees evil on his face. Round the corner from the by-street there was a square of ancient Hanson houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate, and let in flats and chambers to all sorts and conditions of men, map engravers, architects, shady lawyers, and the agents of obscure enterprises. One house, however, second from the corner, was still occupied entire, and at the door of this, which wore a great air of wealth and comfort, though it was now plunged in darkness, except for the fanlight, Mr. Utterson stopped and knocked. A well-dressed, elderly servant opened the door. "Is Jekyll at home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "I will see Mr. Utterson," said Poole, admitting the visitor, as he spoke, into a large, low-roofed, comfortable hall paved with flags, warmed, after a fashion of a country house, by a bright open fire, and furnished with costly cabinets of oak. "Will you wait here by the fire, sir, or shall I give you a light in the dining-room?" "Here, thank you," said the lawyer, and he drew near and leaned on the tall fender. This hall, in which he was now left alone, was a pet fancy of his friend the doctor's, and Utterson himself was wont to speak of it as the pleasantest room in London. But tonight there was a shudder in his blood. The face of Hyde sat heavy on his memory. He felt, what was rare with him, a nausea and distaste of life, and in the gloom of his spirits he seemed to read a menace in the flickering of the fireplace, on the polished cabinets, and the uneasy starting of the shadow on the roof. He was ashamed of his relief when Poole presently returned to announce that Dr. Jekyll was gone out. "I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the old dissecting-room, Poole," he said. "Is that right, when Dr. Jekyll is from home?" "Quite right, Mr. Utterson, sir," replied the servant. "Mr. Hyde has a key." "Your master seems to repose a great deal of trust in that young man, Poole," resumed the other musingly. "Yes, sir, he does indeed," said Poole. "We all have orders to obey him." "I do not think I have ever met Mr. Hyde," asked Utterson. "Oh dear, sir, he never dines here," replied the butler. "Indeed, we see very little of him on this side of the house. He mostly comes and goes by the laboratory." "Well, good night, Poole." "Good night, Mr. Utterson." And the lawyer set out homeward with a very heavy heart. "Poor Harry Jekyll," he thought. "My mind misgives me that he is in deep waters. He was wild when he was a long while ago, to be sure, but in the law of God there is no statute of limitations. Ay, it must be that, the ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace. Punishment coming, pede claudo, years after memory had forgotten and self-love condoned the fault." And the lawyer, scared by the thought, brooded a while on his own past, groping in all the corners of his memory, lest by chance some jack-in-the-box of an old iniquity should leap to light there. His past was fairly blameless. Few men could read the rolls of their life with less apprehension. Yet he was humbled to the dust by the many ill things he had done, and raised up again into a sober and fearful gratitude by the many he had come so near to doing yet avoided. And then, by a return on his former subject, he conceived a spark of hope. So here he's talking about the fact that he's thinking Jekyll must have done something in his youth that he's ashamed of, or something that something that's happened that he's not happy about. And he's thinking of his own past and thinking of sort of all the near misses that he he could have got himself caught up in but didn't. This Master Hyde, if he were studied, thought he, must have secrets of his own, black secrets by the look of him, secrets compared to which poor Jekyll's worst would be like sunshine. Things cannot continue as they are. It turns me cold to think of this creature stealing like a thief to Harry's bedside. Poor Harry, what awakening, and the danger of it, for if this Hyde suspects the existence of the will, he may grow impatient to inherit. I must put my shoulders to the wheel, if Jekyll will but let me, he added. If Jekyll will only let me. For once more he saw before his mind's eye, as clear as transparency, the strange clauses of the will. So at the end of this chapter here, Utterson is talking about the fact that he's worried that Hyde is going to find out that he is actually going to be the benefactor in the will. And obviously, if he's worried that if he finds out that he's going to inherit, should anything happen to Jekyll, then that means that he will do something, to hurt Jekyll. So we've got a phrase here which is put your shoulder to the wheel, and that just means sort of get stuck in and do your best. So he's saying here that he's going to get stuck in and make sure, if he can, if Jekyll will allow him, that he can sort of try to intervene and help Jekyll if need be. So that is the end of the second chapter, and I hope that it was useful to you to have me read it to you, and I will see you guys next week.